You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with PR consultant Alex Deane and director of the Demos think tank Polly Mackenzie. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Times looks at Simon Case's departure from the investigation into Downing Street Christmas parties. The Mirror covers the same story. Their headline, Party Probe Office had a party. The Telegraph also looks at the fallout of the Cabinet Secretary's removal. Simon Case stepping down from the investigation puts pressure on Number 10, according to The Guardian. The Express urges people to put faith in Boris after a week that says has left the Tories down but not out. Omicron infections now out of control, reads the front of the Eye, as cases of the new variant continue to surge. The Financial Times also leads with Omicron. Their headline, Omicron no less severe, experts say. Now cut the 10-day rule is the headline of the Daily Mail, as there are calls to return to 7-day isolation. And the Star predicts snow and more COVID on Christmas Day. With me tonight, PR consultant Alex Deane and director of the Demos think tank Polly Mackenzie. Welcome to you both. Let's start with the Telegraph, and this is the story about fresh leaks potentially derailing the Prime Minister's bid to move on from that by-election defeat. Alex.
It seems that the Prime Minister and Number 10 cannot get past these issues over parties and allegations over hypocrisy. And as a lot of the fronts say, Simon Case's departure from the investigation over the allegations concerned are really, I think, quite harmful. There'll be some people who try to say that this is a Westminster bubble story, but I think it's not. I think that this is a real issue for Number 10 to get a grip on. I thought the Prime Minister's apology today, taking personal responsibility for the by-election defeat in North Shropshire, was the right note to take. And I think he's going to have to take personal responsibility for the investigation into these parties as well.
Polly, what do you think?
I wasn't enormously impressed by the Prime Minister's apology today in that kind of extraordinary interview with your correspondent, Sam Coates. Actually, the Prime Minister said he takes full responsibility for everything that happens in the government because he and the government didn't persuade the journalists not to focus on parties. And that's an odd kind of way of taking responsibility. For him, it seems to be all about a kind of media management strategy. And for me, it's the fundamental thing. There is an absolutely cast iron guaranteed way to stop the media talking about your bad behaviour, and it's not to do the bad behaviour. Unfortunately, there's no way to go back in time and deal with this issue. But, you know, that's why it's so difficult to deal with, because it really does speak to the character of both the Prime Minister and his leadership and the staff and the people he puts around him. I mean, it's completely absurd to have put Simon Case in charge of this investigation into what parties happened when he himself in his office seems to have hosted or enabled to go ahead a party which may or may not have been a breach of the rules. We don't know, but certainly is at the margin of what is or isn't allowed. And it's interesting because some of the commentary around this seems to be questioning whether it was reasonable or not to have those rules in place, and whether it should have been all right to have a party gathering after work amongst colleagues who were already spending the day together. And that's a reasonable debate, but it's a reasonable debate for us to have had last year. Those were the rules in place. It was very clear you should not have a work party or social gathering. And so for the people who put those rules in place to have broken them is extremely serious. The person who's going to take over this investigation from Simon Case is Sue Gray, who is forensic and formidable, used to be the Director General in charge of propriety and ethics, now second permanent secretary at the Housing and Levelling Up Department. And, you know, I think we can have quite a lot of faith in her. But the problem is that the Prime Minister, and this is where I do agree with Alex, the Prime Minister is going to have to accept that he permitted either a culture or that tolerated that level of wrongdoing, or that he directly permitted those parties. And saying that you take responsibility for that is about more than just blaming the media for reporting about it.
Alex, you wanted to come in?
Hang on. I agree with some of what Polly says. I, of course, agree with the praise for Sue Gray, and I think that she's the right person to take over. But Simon Case was definitely the right person to appoint because he's the Cabinet Secretary. The issue for me now on these stories is twofold. First of all, if Simon Case was at a party that was alleged to have been in breach of these things, he surely would have known that, and he should have recused himself at the beginning rather than now. I can't believe that people are sitting around waiting for somebody to say, hang on, weren't you at one of these, before they say, oh, OK, I've got to step back from it. But the second point is that no one seems to have argued from the government perspective, including those in the last week, myself included, who've been defending Boris and the Prime Minister, that London, as I recall, was in Tier 2 at the time, which permitted work gatherings. And it seems to me that that seems to be the way out for a lot of the discussion. It doesn't look good, but that was within the rules, as far as I recall.
Yeah, the Times now looking at the future investigation. And Polly, the question has to be whether the public will have any confidence in future investigations into these parties.
I think it's quite hard for people to have confidence, partly because it's genuinely complicated. There's a lot of different parties. I believe there's supposed parties that may have occurred in the Downing Street flat. There's parties that occurred within Downing Street, within the office area. There's potentially Simon Case's party. There's allegations that there were parties at the Department for Work and Pensions. And I've lost track, and I'm supposed to keep up with this stuff. So for an investigation to go through all of those in a systematic way, to collect all of the evidence, you know, in a patient and considered way, is necessary. But even then, it's quite hard to get over that hump of public opinion, which comes out of the sense of chaos and confusion that has reigned over all of this.
And that is public opinion that's being reflected within the Conservative Party. The FT reporting about angry Conservatives warning the Prime Minister he could be out by mid-2022. Alex, do you think that might be the case?
I don't, actually. I don't think that the letters are going to be flying into Sir Graham Brady, but I do think that Polly is right about that sense of confusion, and I think that it played a significant part in the North Shropshire by-election results. I thought the front of the Times captured these things well. The person appointed to oversee an inquiry into these parties, the one that Polly forgot was the one at CCHQ, allegedly, and the one that led to Sean Bailey stepping down from one of his roles in London. The case that's been made on the front of the Times is that you've appointed this person to oversee things, and now that person's having to recuse himself. Well, that's right, because for the last week, we've been pointing towards Simon Case as a figure of authority who can oversee these inquiries. And Number 10 must have known, or at least Simon Case himself must have known, that he couldn't with authority oversee that, given that he was in attendance, allegedly, at one of these parties himself. So it's very tricky. But no, I don't think, actually, that these letters will be going into Graham Brady, not least because a large number of Conservative MPs owe their seats to Boris Johnson. He, after all, won the 80-seat majority that the party now enjoys in Parliament. So government will now be wishing desperately just to get to Christmas, have a fire break between all these events and 2022, and have a reset next year.
Polly, very quickly, can the Prime Minister keep the support of his party? The Daily Express saying down but not out, why we must put faith in Boris.
Yeah, they're quoting Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's kind of trying to rally the troops. I think Alex is right. It's unlikely that this will lead to direct the resignation of Boris Johnson or to him being ousted by his MPs. But I do think it's potentially the beginning of the end for his popularity with those people. And if COVID continues to get worse, if inflation continues to get worse, if there isn't kind of light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the government actually achieving things, that pressure will worsen.
Let's continue with the eye. Shall we start with that one, this section? And that front page looking at the infection rates of Omicron, variant doubling every 1.5 days in London and northeast of England. Alex?
Well, it depends on what you think out of control is. It's definitely true that Omicron is more virulent and that London, as the least jabbed area of the country, is experiencing this worse than some other parts. But it does seem that the assertions that we received when we went through our vaccination programme, that vaccines were going to break the connection between infection and hospitalisation, still remains broadly true. So we are having many more cases reported, as the front of the eye says. But given that we are testing at twice the rate we were testing last week or a year ago, if you make the annual comparison, that's not that surprising. The important thing will be whether we're seeing an uptick in hospitalisations or sadly, in deaths. And so far, at least...
But they're talking about the infection rates. What would you say out of control would be? How would you measure that?
Well, that's my point. If the only consequence of people being infected with Omicron is that they get infected, then that actually, given that we're all going to have coronavirus sooner or later, doesn't matter too much. The thing that matters to our country is whether people have to go to hospital or whether we get seriously ill. And if we've broken the connection between infection and hospitalisation, then actually people getting coronavirus, given we're all going to have it, isn't the main thing, is it?
Polly, do you agree with that?
I do. It's just that the numbers now for Omicron appear to be getting so large that even though we have the vaccines in place and have been doing a phenomenal work in terms of the booster program, that there is a real danger that those hospitalizations, which are starting to creep up, especially in London, deaths which aren't yet, but we know that that is a lagging indicator. It takes time for people to go from catching the disease through to getting very ill, through to getting into hospital, through to losing their life. So we know that takes longer. It just what the medical scientists are telling us is that those numbers are starting to look really very worrying. And of course, it's often we hear this sense that, oh, the NHS is obsessing about COVID and it's forgotten about heart disease and cancer and strokes and diabetes. Actually, it's that if Omicron gets out of control, if we have those hospitalizations from COVID, that eats up capacity of the NHS and reduces its ability to think about cancer and heart disease and its wider services to the community. So I think, there is this risk now that we are going to see numbers which are beyond what the NHS can manage easily.
Very quickly, I just want to bring Alex in on the Daily Mail front page and this cutting of the isolation days that's been suggested. Very quickly, we've only got about 20 seconds, sorry.
Suggestion that we should reduce the isolation required if you are pinged or if you're sick, and I think that must be right, given that in the end we've got rid of our red list. Most of us are going to get coronavirus sooner or later. We've got to get back to normal, and some of that's got to be reflected in a reduction in isolation times.